Hello, and welcome to Empathy for the Devil. I'm Sam Parker.
I'm Matt Thomas.
I'm Chula Gunawardena.
In every episode, we're going to be diving into the lives of individuals in the spotlight who left us too soon, but may still face harsh judgments for how they lived, what they became, or how they died.
Join us as we peel back the layers of their stories with empathy and understanding, exploring their journeys from mortals to myths from a modern mental health perspective, aiming to understand the person behind the legend.
We want to bring empathy to the misunderstood, misjudged, or even demonised. Empathy for the devil.
A quick word of warning. We're going to discuss some heavy themes as part of Whitney's story, such as childhood trauma, including child sexual abuse, racism and colorism, homophobia, codependency, domestic violence, and of course, her drug addiction, eventual overdose, and drowning.
Hello, welcome back to Empathy for the Devil. This week, I'm going to be telling you the story of a true pop culture icon, known as The Voice. She was one of the most awarded entertainers and best-selling artists of all time, with over 220 million records sold worldwide. The legend, Whitney Houston. However, behind her success lay a dark reality. Whitney was intimately familiar with how punishing the spotlight could be, and spent a large part of her life battling with addiction. Sadly, in 2012, at 48 years old, she tragically passed away, leaving behind a legacy that continues to resonate today.
Bloody hell, Chula, a legacy, eh? That's a bit of an understatement, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, an absolute icon.
Yeah.
I mean, who doesn't know Whitney Houston?
Well, exactly. It's like she became, and still is, I think, one of the biggest pop icons in the world ever.
Yeah.
And that will continue for quite some time.
She was a really good actress as well. I mean, I remember The Bodyguard.
Oh, who could forget The Bodyguard?
Yeah, her
I
and Kevin
cried.
Costner. Did you?
I cried, yeah.
Yeah.
As I've said a few times, I used to be a mobile DJ in my
Oh,
misspent
yes.
youth. And I Want to Dance with
Did
Somebody. Yes, I did, actually. I Want to Dance with Somebody was normally in the first three songs that I played. It always filled the dance floor.
Yeah.
It was absolute guaranteed banker.
Oh,
Yeah.
banging tune.
Yeah.
Absolute banging tune. Yeah, I remember it. I think when that came out, I was 13. I had the cassette of the album and I knew all the lyrics.
But Chula, I mean, we know about your musical tastes, and we know that you're slightly more inclined to the alt metal and of the Slipknot variety.
Yes.
So, what is it about Whitney? What made you choose Whitney to bring to the podcast today?
Well, apart from the fact, that she's just got a truly amazing voice, one of the best voices and singing voices in history. I suppose I do have a very a personal connection with her story. So there's lots of different aspects that I closely identify with. The childhood sexual abuse, being a victim of racism, music being the only thing that, really mattered to her in her life at the beginning, falling into addictive disorder to manage emotional difficulties, and then finding herself in a codependent relationship, a codependent using relationship, and also experiencing the controlling nature of the music industry.
Wow, but it sounds like it's going to be a roller coaster ride.
Well, it's definitely a story that's close to my heart.
Wow, okay. Well, should we get cracking? Should we,
I think we should.
Sam,
Yeah, let's do
do you want
it.
to do the honours?
Oh,
Yeah.
yes. Yes. Lovely, beautiful. Whitney, this is for you. Just to hold Whitney during this time that we're going to talk about her. Hopefully to honour her memory, her talent, her drive, her incredible life force, life energy. This one's for you, Whitney. There you go.
Thanks, Sam.
Thanks, Sam.
So, the story begins when Whitney was born on August the 9th in New Jersey in 1963. Her mother, Sissy, and father, John. She had two brothers, Michael and Gary, and music was in the family. Whitney seemed almost destined to become a singer. Dionne Warwick was her cousin, and her mother was a successful backing singer, working for Aretha Franklin and Elvis, amongst others.
Whoa.
Yeah, so amazing kind of musical success.
Yeah.
Although she didn't quite make it as a solo artist, so she did well as a backing singer. But, she poured all of perhaps her unfulfilled dreams in that area into Whitney. They went to church every Sunday in Newark, and she loved singing in the gospel choir. When Whitney, there was something else that sort of countered a lot of what sounds like a very stable home life, in that she got bullied in her neighborhood for being lighter skinned than the people in her community.
It started that young, did it?
Yeah, when she was a kid, apparently. That's
Right,
what
okay.
has been documented.
Right.
And it's something, again, going back to what I said a minute ago, it's something that I experienced when I was young. And that feeling of wanting to be white and wanting to fit in. And I guess for her, it would have been that she wanted to be darker and she wanted to fit in with the people around her. And that's almost racism within racism, getting it from her own community. Another addition to why her family home wasn't quite as it seemed is that in the documentary Whitney from 2018, it's revealed that Whitney experienced childhood sexual abuse, allegedly by an extended female family member.
I was reading Robin's biography,
Right.
which we'll come to talk about later.
About
Robin,
her,
who was
yeah.
a long-term friend, partner of Whitney. And she was saying that she never mentioned it. However, as we know, it's not simple as that, is it, sometimes, in terms of disclosing that kind of stuff.
Well, the connection there for me is that
Yeah.
I didn't feel that I could tell anyone.
Right.
And I didn't really speak about it properly until I was in rehab at 29.
Wow.
And we know that Whitney didn't share about it until in her later life. She felt she couldn't tell her mother. And she definitely never spoke publicly about the alleged abuse. And whilst she didn't tell anybody, there were obviously times when she was crying out for help or signifying that something could have happened. There's a quote from 1990 where she said, "Child abuse makes me angry. It bothers me that children who are helpless, who depend on adults for security, care and their love, it makes me angry."
I'm really, really conscious of how it probably brings up quite a lot of feelings. And I guess I'm sitting there with a lot of compassion and a little bit of, I don't know, I just want to, that never happened to me. So I guess I'm just feeling for you in this moment right now.
And it is a very powerful thing. It can become a very defining factor in terms of personality development, for example. And then that affects all your relationships, but you don't really realise why or know what's going on. And it's only when, if you're lucky enough, I would say, to come into recovery and get treatment and be able to work these things through, that you can really heal properly.
But it is possible.
It's definitely possible. Yeah. And another thing that I relate to very closely is the pushing down of the pain and using music to channel all of that trauma into. And, music for me became a lifeline. I would say that it saved me on many levels. And I think that with Whitney, you can hear, the depth of emotion in her voice, and some of that may be even her pain coming through. Moving on from her early childhood, her mother had an affair with a priest, or an alleged affair with a priest. And at the family's church, the minister at the family's church.
That's like a double whammy, isn't it? A, the affair, and B, it's with a priest. It's like, that's verboten.
I think it's minister, though. Priest is Catholic, isn't it?
Oh,
Minister,
right, okay.
It would be a minister, I guess.
Well, it's a figure of authority
figure of
in the community
authority.
that you probably shouldn't be shagging.
Exactly.
Yeah, and it's allegedly, it's your mum. And B, it's somebody, as you say, that's a figure of authority that shouldn't be fucking doing that. And actually, through your childhood and your teens, listening to those, I don't know if they're called sermons in this particular church or what, but certainly there'll be the implication of what you're meant to do and what you're not meant to do. And to have that disregarded by two really, really important people in your life would be really, really unsettling, wouldn't it?
And
especially such a figure of authority as a priest is like God or whoever, whatever he's called, the pastor, or who is like the moral the moral compass of the community. So it must have shattered a lot. Number one, mums aren't really meant to have sex except for the one time they did that created you. And two,
I got news for you, Matt.
and number two, the pastor certainly isn't meant to have sex when he's preaching fire and brimstone to everybody else. It must have been a real letdown.
And there were rumours as well that her father wasn't exactly faithful either, and had been a bit of a philanderer. But for Whitney, I think it was her mother's behaviour that she found more difficult to accept. So she kind of demonised her mother and angelicised her father, which is very common in my work. I found that when parents divorce, children often do that because it's easier for them to comprehend that one person is all bad and one person is all good. As opposed to sort of really being able to understand or conceptualize the complexity of a relationship.
Sometimes as adults as well, it's really, really hard to get out of the mindset that it's a black and white and either or, a good or bad, you know, that kind of duality. And actually the fact of the matter is that we're all inherently fucked up and do stupid, ridiculous, shameful things, but also there's a part of us that is good and has great intentions and wants to do the best, you know. I mean, that's the reality, but I think it takes a long time, particularly when you're thinking about your parents, to see them in that through that lens. And I think for me it really only happened when I had kids,
right?
You know, that I kind of was like, oh, hang on a minute. But yeah, I mean, you know, thinking about Whitney and being in her teens, it must have been tough.
Yeah, and she was already lost, I imagine, after experiencing the childhood sexual abuse. She already had her views of the security that parents or adults were supposed to bring shattered. And then she's met with even more fallibility on behalf of her parents. So where can she turn? Where's the security? Where's the sort of holding as a child? It wasn't there. So at 15, she was already performing on stage with her mother. She was one of the first African-American women to appear on the cover of 17 magazine. But music remained her true love. And she was discovered in a nightclub by Arista Records' Clive Davis.
Clive Davis, the mogul.
Yeah. And
the legend
when she was just 19.
Wow.
And he took the helm of her career and helped her to navigate towards what she became.
I mean, I've got to say, 19 is actually reassuringly old
these days.
By some standards. Yeah. I mean, some of the people that we've spoken about were practically dead by the time they were 19.
Yeah.
So actually, it seems a little bit more comfortable.
Yes, definitely. And then she spent the next 2 years working on her debut album, finding the best producers and songwriters to support her. So in 1985, she released that album, Whitney Houston, with 3 number-1 singles in the US, which I'm sure you know.
How will I know if he really loves me? Oh, I remember
Greatest Love
that.
of All was another one.
I Believe That Children Are Our Future.
George Benson.
And Saving All My Love for You.
Oh, amazing.
She almost immediately became a smash pop sensation overnight.
I remember it well.
I remember it well.
So as we know as clinicians, a lot of the stuff that happens to us in our childhood and a lot of things that people experience as trauma or dysfunction or difficulty can come out in our relationships. You know, there's a saying in the 12-step programs that you don't get into a relationship for the first 2 years of your recovery. You're supposed to get a plant, and then if that's still alive, you get a pet. And if the two of them are still alive after 2 years, then you're ready for a relationship. And I never quite understood that, but now I understand that, you know, it's because in our intimate relationships, all our stuff can come up, you know.
By the way, just for anyone who's considering going into a 12-step program, nobody ever sticks to that.
No, they fucking don't. Absolutely
just
no
as a
way.
caveat, don't let it stop you from getting into recovery.
Do not let that stop you.
Oh, no, it's not a prerequisite at all.
Did you wait 2 years, Sheila?
I did.
Did you?
Yeah.
Did you?
Yeah.
You little swat.
I'm not even going to bother asking, Matt.
I didn't wait 2 minutes.
But anyway, moving back to Whitney, she had a relationship with Robin Crawford, who was, in all appearances, her best friend, but actually she was her love interest, and they were together in a relationship. They met way before, in 1980, before Whitney was famous.
On a basketball court, I think.
Is that right?
Yeah. I was reading a little bit about Robin last night, actually.
Yeah. Robin
was a couple of years older, I think, than Whitney. And Whitney was obviously this, I think she called her something like, she said she looked like an angel, but oh my God, she was not.
Right.
You know, Whitney had the you know, this sort of angelic look, but actually she was feisty, you know, and edgy, barefaced, no makeup, no hair, no this, no that, just you know, and
just exquisitely beautiful.
Oh,
with a glint in her eye,
ridiculously
unbelievable
beautiful.
glint.
And also what I got is that she was fucking ambitious.
Yeah.
You know, she knew to a
She
large
wanted
part
to
what
succeed,
she was getting into in terms of what success could look like.
Right.
And I think her and Robin definitely decided to do that together.
Yeah. And the relationship had become sexual and romantic, but because of the prejudices of that era, they had to kind of keep it all quiet. And I think it sort of went into a dormant phase. But, you know, she had to hide her sexuality. It's almost trauma upon trauma upon trauma, you know.
And it also really reminds me of the George Michael story.
Yes. Yeah.
You know, I mean, there's a lot of parallels there, isn't there, in terms of, you know, megastar, world-class talent that somebody is in possession of and has to make decisions, whether they're fully informed or consensual, who fucking knows? Probably not. But at some point, there's a choice to be made.
Yeah.
Am I going to do it or am I not?
Yeah.
Yeah.
You know, and it feels like they both said yes on some level, you know, to their capabilities of being young people.
Yeah.
But what strikes me really is that, you know, the similarities are enormous.
Yeah.
And there was a fucking price to pay.
Yeah.
There's a massive price to pay, and ultimately it's like a denial of self, isn't it?
Yeah.
It's actually like leaving your true self or your authentic self behind.
An ego split.
Exactly, to step into this other persona. And sadly they weren't alone. I mean, we were talking just before this about I was watching a documentary last night that it was absolutely it was blatant that in the 80s and 90s for a global entertainer to come out as gay would have been career suicide.
Right.
So the stakes were really, really high, and the pressure to stay closeted, as the term goes, would have been massive.
Yeah.
And it is better now, of course.
Yes.
But it fucking isn't if you're a football player.
Yeah.
It's exactly the same.
Yeah.
If you're a male football player, you don't.
Yeah.
You know, there's a couple of people that have. It's almost like that sort of domain is still very much stuck in this era that we're now talking about.
Yeah, it's still stigmatized.
Yeah, 100%.
And she kept Robin around her. So Robin sort of took over managerial responsibilities and managed part of her early career. She kept her close by. But the problem was the family didn't really like the influence that Robin had on Whitney. So then there was a point where they pushed her to the background, and then Whitney's father took over the management.
Do you think the family knew?
I think the family did know. I think they
knew.
Yeah, they knew.
So really their rejection of Robin could also have been a rejection of their daughter's sexuality.
Absolutely.
Yeah, 100%. And also the industry knew as well. And I think Clive David says something about, we didn't talk about it specifically, and maybe they did, maybe they didn't. Let's assume that they didn't. However, it's interesting to note as well that Clive Davis has now has got a man as a partner.
Right.
We can't overemphasise really what people thought at that time. And also we've talked about, you know, the AIDS crisis and God knows what. You know, it's just a fucking no-no, wasn't it? So in a way, yes, there was collusion in terms of the industry and people that are guiding their professional career and her family. But we can also understand how that might have happened.
Yeah, absolutely. And with her father taking over, you know, there could have also been other motivations, because he went from earning about $500 a week to earning thousands a week. So there could have been ulterior motives going on, and there were aspects of that to come later on.
I mean, you know, we've seen this a lot in the work that we do and in the podcasts that we've covered in other people, that there is a certain mentality that at some stage the artist might become the meal ticket.
Yes.
And that's totally understandable as well.
It's human
especially
nature.
when the people are economically disadvantaged,
and
and there's a real need for financial support, and there's a real desire from the artist to help out the family and friends.
And at that point, a lot of Whitney's family were put on the payroll, and her brother started working for her in different capacities. And moving on from there, we find that Whitney then suffers even further when there's frictions around her race from her fans. So there were people in I suppose all over the world, perhaps, but definitely in America, who felt that she wasn't black enough in the way that she was presenting herself, and that was somehow some kind of betrayal.
Yeah, so I think she got booed. I think it was at the Soul Train Awards from her peers, and that yeah, I mean that must have been really, really difficult.
And just for some context, I don't know if you guys know what Soul Train is. It was like the music show for the black community. It was massive, but it was like the absolute standard. So for a black artist to be booed at the Soul Train Awards for not being black enough would have been a massive.
That would have been so hurtful, you know.
Absolutely.
And there is a quote actually where Whitney says, "Sometimes it gets down to you're not black enough for them. You're not R&B enough. You're very pop. The white audience has taken you away from them."
But also, let's be clear that Clive Davis wanted her to be a pop act.
Yes.
From the fucking get-go.
Yeah.
And so did she.
Yeah.
We're looking at here is a conscious career path choice and a market, you know, in terms of what market they were going for. And apparently, I was reading a bit about Clive Davis. You know, he was incredibly ambitious, ex-lawyer turned A&R and label head. You know, he's incredible, legendary. I mean, there's too many to know. But apparently this kind of conversation about, well, what do you want? You know, how successful do you want to be? Yeah. Because actually, if you want to do what you want to do artistically, that's not going to get you to where you want to be. If you want to be if you want to be a star, you're going to have to do it my way. Yeah. And therefore you're going to have to be played on certain radio stations. You're going to have to appeal to a certain demographic. Yeah. And this is how I can do this for you, your choice.
But you have to abandon yourself.
Yeah.
That's the deal.
Yeah. So,
which weirdly is a bit like the deal that Robert Johnson is purported to have made with the devil at the Crossroads. Yes. It's kind of like that. It is literally, and again, for context, that you know, Robert Johnson, the legendary blues guitar player, who influenced a whole generation of people and gave birth to the Rolling Stones and the Beatles, for example, was said to have disappeared for a couple of days at the Crossroads, done a deal with the devil, and sold his soul for musical talent. So it's kind of like, you know, what you're talking about is actually that metaphor in real action.
Yeah, absolutely. It's the success within the commercialisation of your art, and how far are you willing to go?
So the next chapter of Whitney's life is when she married Bobby Brown. After a 3-year engagement, they got married in 1992, and it appeared very passionate and loving, and they seemed like, you know, an inseparable couple. But unfortunately, over the next decade, it kind of soured. He was a bit of a bad boy, and he was known for that, and she was coming from a different place.
You know, he was a black man. He was singing R&B. He was a bit of a player, and
he came out of a boy band, didn't he?
Yes.
New Edition.
Was it New Edition?
Oh, really? Okay.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
All I think with Bobby is my prerogative.
My prerogative. Yeah. So he would have been somebody who had been exposed to the spotlight very early in his life, and probably, to a certain extent, done a bit of a, let's just call it the sellout.
Yeah.
If that's what we're
saying. Like the Robbie Williams of New Edition.
I don't know enough about New Edition. Let's go down that route. I like it.
Yeah. So he was So he was charismatic. Yeah. He was sexy, attractive, exciting.
Danced like a motherfucker.
Yeah, absolutely. And and then Whitney's, you know, having a bad day, and at the Soul Train Awards, and there's Bobby. I think he was performing. Yeah. And bingo,
they came together.
Yeah.
Okay.
And it wasn't long after that, I think it was just a year, they had a unplanned pregnancy and her daughter was born, Chrissy.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
And whilst Whitney wanted to take her on tour, there were some practicalities that perhaps weren't quite right for that. So she was looked after by Whitney's Auntie Bay. And there seemed to be a bit of a tug of war. You know, I think the family thought that touring wasn't a place for a child, but Whitney wanted her close to her. So there was a lot going on in the dynamic there.
I mean, a tour, let's just be honest about this, is a fucking horrific place to bring a baby on.
Yeah.
But it's like nowadays with these huge multi-billion pound international tours, it's like it's possible for people to have their own entourage and their kind of, literally their own planes just for the babies.
And I would say it depends a lot on the health of the people, doesn't it?
Yeah.
If you've got people who are healthy and touring in a way that is healthy, then it can be a fairly good environment. But if you've got the opposite of that, and unfortunately this was the case with Whitney and Bobby, there were a lot of drugs going on.
And it was the 80s and touring was still pretty shit back then.
Yeah.
Well, the other thing to say is that it's, it is difficult for women who are performers, musicians. That I guess there are ways of working it out. But being a mother, I suppose, is unlike being a father in many respects, because, a dad wouldn't probably think twice about going on tour and leaving the baby with mum.
Yeah, that's true.
But, I'm not making any fucking grand statements. I'm just saying that's kind of how it is, isn't it?
Yeah.
I suppose for women in the workplace, full stop.
Yeah.
Actually.
Her personal assistant, Mary, said she was the best mother she knew how to be, but you've got to have that motherly love. I just don't think if she knew how to give it.
I mean, it's quite damning in a way, isn't it? It's we'll never know whether or not she had that motherly love.
Yeah.
Well,
funny.
she might have had it, but not been able to express it.
Yeah.
It's a bit like what we were talking about before, though, isn't it? No person decides that they're not going to love their fucking kids, do they?
No. No.
And what I really, really was surprised about when I had my son is that I had all these ideas about what sort of mum I was going to be, and I was nothing like it. Yeah. And actually, what you end up reverting to, because you're fucking knackered and, exhausted, and it's so hard, is that you end up doing what you grew up with. It just happens automatically. It's almost like that blueprint is sort of seared into your head, and you end up behaving exactly how, even if you didn't like it, you still do the same things.
You just go, oh my God, I'm becoming my parents. Yeah.
And when addiction is present, it's kind of like, it takes it to a whole new level as well.
Yeah.
It's kind of like, but because where people with addiction, as we've discussed before, lose the power of choice. And so myself as an active addict, I made so many promises to myself and to my children that I would stop. I would be a different person. I wouldn't be doing that anymore. I wouldn't be behaving like that anymore. And, and they just disappeared the next day. Yeah. As soon as the next craving came, it's like everything else fades away.
I mean, it's fucking gutting, isn't it?
It's so fucking cruel. You're right.
Yeah, it's
absolutely.
And it kind of makes me think, Chula, a little bit about the sort of issues that can come up with kids that have grown up with parents in active addiction. So I was just wondering what your experiences have been.
Well, I've worked with a lot of children who have had parents as addicts, and I work with them when they're adults. So a lot of the work is about going back into the childhood and saying, what was that experience like for you? And there's lots of parents who, have the money, like Bobby and Whitney. They had money. It wasn't as if they couldn't provide for their daughter, but it's about being emotionally present. I think addiction takes parents away from their children on that emotional level, and being able to provide and be present, be emotionally present.
And it almost goes back to that still face experiment, doesn't it?
Yes.
So, mum or dad might be depressed, anxious, worried about, financial insecurity, and somehow that just takes them away, the gaze away from the baby. And I can almost imagine being stoned or drunk or whatever, you're not going to be present, are you? What are the general common problems that adult children actually have alcoholics or
well, there is such a thing as adult child of an alcoholic or adult child of an addict. We understand it to be a condition as much as addiction is a disorder or a condition. And there's certain things that come along with that. And one of the things is something called hypervigilance.
Hypervigilance. That's a big word, Sheila. Do you want to break it down a bit?
Well, hypervigilance really is, it's due to the fact that the parent may have been unpredictable in their behaviour. So what the child does is they try to unconsciously, the processes are trying to second guess what the parent will do, perhaps when they're intoxicated or under the influence. And then that develops as a pattern of relating or a way of being. And then the hypervigilance is, as an adult, somebody is just always looking around to second guess what's happening next.
So like someone in the jungle, just kind of looking out for every single type of danger that might happen, and just being permanently in a high state of alert.
Yes, exactly.
Just waiting for the next thing, the next terrible thing to happen.
Yeah. Moving back to Bobby Brown and Whitney's relationship.
Yeah.
Whitney's career was starting to climb, and The Bodyguard came out. In 1992, and it set box office records. It had the top-selling soundtrack with the single
"I Will Always Love You."
Yeah, which was at number one for what, months or something?
That video.
Years.
Yeah. Well, Bobby Brown wasn't too happy about the success because he kind of became this plus one, and Whitney had all the focus and the attention, and I think she tried to give him some leverage, but it wasn't really working, and that caused a bit of a fracture in their relationship. And it's reported that led to some really difficult times in terms of domestic violence, and the police being called for things.
Oh wow.
Yeah, and there was the sexual harassment accusations that he had, and the potential prison sentences. But Whitney wanted him around and wanted to be with him, but it was a very volatile relationship. Whitney wanted him around, but I don't think the drugs and alcohol helped.
Well, I mean, marriage is hard enough as it is, isn't it?
Without addiction.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, it's the success and power disparity between a couple, where one person is like, I mean, it's not as though people didn't know fucking Bobby Brown was. Of course they did. He was huge.
Yeah.
But she was a global megastar.
Yeah.
He was infamous as well, wasn't he?
Yeah.
He is still infamous as being a bad influence,
Bad boy.
let's just say.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But actually, I mean, Whitney chose to have him around. So I don't think it's as simple as being able to say he was just a bad influence on her and it's all his fault.
No, that whole idea that she was squeaky clean wasn't true either, because in terms of her drug use, her brothers had introduced her to smoking cannabis when she was young.
Right.
And she was drawn to that herself, probably because she was self-medicating some of her trauma, her childhood trauma.
And also, as we said earlier, Robin said Whitney was no angel.
Yeah.
The Whitney that we've got on the front cover there, the sort of all-American girl, that was a marketing presentation of her, wasn't it?
And we know that when someone who's no angel meets someone else who's no angel, all sorts of shit can go down.
Yeah, well, it slowly became a very destructive relationship and quite codependent, with these two addicts being together. And it's, we've talked about codependency in terms of, the codependent and the addict, someone who's trying to save someone from their addiction, but finding purpose in that, or maybe even value. But this was yes, what you described in another episode. But the thing between these two people was more what we see with two addicts who are using together, in that they collude and enable the addiction to grow between them.
Yeah.
And would you say there will be similarities between Whitney and Bobby and Kurt and Courtney?
Definitely so. Yeah, I would see some parallels there. It's a similar kind of relationship.
And Sid and Nancy.
Yeah.
Millions of others.
Yeah.
I mean, I think it's something that goes with the territory of addiction as well. Certainly in my perspective, I was always looking for someone who drank like me and who used drugs like me.
Were you?
Yeah, absolutely. It's like the perfect fucking companion. Yeah. And then, interestingly, in recovery, I started looking for someone who was in recovery like me.
Yeah.
And so it's to do with trying to find your soulmate, and it's like whatever condition you are in, you are going to try and find the person that reflects that condition back to you.
Yeah, absolutely. It was difficult for them to be good parents. It was difficult for them to be, good partners to each other. But the train was moving. They were on that trajectory, and it was just happening. As we know, addiction is a progressive illness. It doesn't stay still for very long. And as that progressed, Robin got pushed further away, and at one point she was taken off the payroll, and in the middle to late 90s, Whitney's drug problems started to take over, and there was cancelled dates, things were spiraling out of control. Her mother managed to get her to rehab at one point.
I was going to ask, did she ever try and get help?
Yeah.
So what was the outcome?
Well, not good. Her father told her it wasn't necessary. And again, that leads us back to, his motivations.
My daddy thinks I'm fine. What's the lyric?
They're trying to make me go to rehab,
And my daddy thinks I'm fine.
Yeah. Yeah.
Interesting.
And it wasn't that he wasn't aware that it could help her. You know, there were other people in their entourage who had had issues, and he'd even supported them to get treatment. But with her, he turned her or steered her away from it.
I mean, sometimes I've seen this a couple of times, and I'm not saying that this is the case, but I'm just putting it out there, that sometimes it doesn't suit other family members for the sick individual to get well.
Yeah.
Because it takes away the control.
Yeah.
Also, I'm thinking about Karen Carpenter in the previous episode, and you know, maybe there's some sort of parallels between Karen's mum and Whitney's dad.
Yeah.
Perhaps.
Maybe even a codependency in that relationship that was keeping them.
It's funny, isn't it? Because, you know, having been to family groups for my codependency in relation to my best friend's addiction, you know, I sat in family meetings with parents and siblings and partners for years and years and years and years. As we would say, you know, addiction is a family illness. And it took us all quite a long time to realise that actually it wasn't just the person that was the addict, you know, our loved one, that was the problem.
It was the whole family.
It was all of us.
Yeah.
But there is also that potential line of thought that if it's like, well, if people stop looking at the addicted person, then they're going to start looking at me.
You know, that family illness played out in the relationship with her dad, because she loved and trusted her dad. You know, and she'd given him a lot of power in the system, the professional system, and he had a lot of power in the family by the sounds of it too. And the problem was that, you know, he eventually got to the point where he allegedly stole loads of money from her.
Allegedly.
Yeah, and things didn't go well. She'd become a bit of an ATM for the people around her, and when that happened, she had to cut him off. You know, so
she cut him off completely.
Eventually,
did she?
Yeah,
Wow.
yeah. And he tried to sue her, I believe.
Right.
I mean, it's all gone fucking tits up at that point, isn't it?
But it was kind of around this time, I think, that I certainly began to get wind that all was not well in the Whitney Houston camp.
Yeah.
And there were kind of rumours spreading around. A lot of people were talking about crack. A lot of people were really implicating Bobby Brown's role in that. But it's kind of like it did begin to spill out, and that picture of perfection wasn't quite such a perfect picture.
Yeah.
Kind of, I guess I'm talking about the early 2000s.
Yeah. And in terms of the public eye, you know, in 1999 she signed the biggest deal that she'd ever signed, you know, or in fact it was any recording artist had ever signed. Wow. I think it was 100 million, and it may have been for sort of 6 albums or 8 albums or something like that, but it was one of the biggest record deals ever signed. And it was after that her father then tried to sue her, you know, because he wasn't involved in that. She was in and out of rehab in the 2000s, so she did finally get there. Yeah. But things hit a particular low when she did the interview with Diane Sawyer.
Yeah, it's awful.
Yeah.
And I didn't see that.
It's so sad.
Is it?
So sad. Yeah. It's the bleakest point.
What was the point of doing it, do you think?
I think she was trying to show that she was okay.
Right.
But there were probably people on Diane Sawyer's side who were trying to expose that she wasn't okay.
Right.
And that's really evident, because it feels in the interview like Diane Sawyer's trying to sort of trip her up and bring her to a point where she exposes herself in a negative light. But both Bobby Brown and Whitney are very defensive, but you can see that they're not well. It always comes to that point where it's very visible. And,
was she really thin at that point?
there is a point in the interview where Diane Sawyer's implying that Whitney is anorexic,
right.
But Whitney's very defensive of that.
I mean, I actually think she looked okay in the interview.
Oh, do you?
It was more the demeanour, it was more her behaviour, it was the
Yeah.
things that she said and how she said them, and the dullness of her eyes. She'd lost
Yeah.
that life, that glint,
Yeah.
that sparkle.
Someone in active addiction,
Yeah.
you could see it, couldn't you? And it wasn't long after that her father died in 2003.
Oh.
Yeah. So it does seem like there's this huge catalogue of, trauma, really, and unfortunate events that have just plagued her whole life. On the one hand, she's got this celebrity status and she's a female black icon who's doing incredibly well. But on the other hand, her personal life, her emotional life, her relationships aren't doing well at all.
But there's also a kind of a theme of real life interfering with superstardom.
Yeah.
Because, let's face it, everybody's dad dies eventually.
Yeah.
It's kind of like, so there are real life events that people go through regardless of who they are or where they are or what their station in life is.
Yeah.
And the other thing is to talk about, at this stage of her life, she was really, it sounds to me like she was on the runaway train of addiction.
Yeah.
And as we know, and as we've discussed before with reference to other artists like Brian Jones and Kurt Cobain, it's actually, once you get to a certain stage, you lose the power of choice.
Yes.
I watched a lecture the other day by Dr. Kevin McCauley.
Yeah. One of my heroes.
Absolutely, one of your heroes, and mine now, actually.
Yeah.
And mine.
And yours too.
What an amazing bloke.
All right, Kevin.
Oh.
And he presents a very good case for addiction as a brain disease, but as more than that, addiction as a brain disease and a psycho, bio, spiritual, cultural and systemic condition where we do actually lose the power of choice. So no matter how many times we try to stop, without help from outside, it's practically impossible. And sometimes, even with help from outside, unless you're actually ready, it still is really difficult.
Yeah.
And so I think it's always really important at this juncture to point out that somebody like Whitney would have lost the power of choice.
Yes.
So no matter how hard she was trying to stop, she would have been unable to stop.
And I think that's something that's really hard for people to grasp if they've never experienced it themselves.
Yeah, fucking tell me about it.
Absolutely.
I could not understand why my best friend, I could see in her eyes when she goes, that's it, that's not happening again. And I could see, because I fucking know her, that she meant it. And I'd go, oh my God, that's over, that's in the past. And then a couple of days later, a couple of weeks later, a couple of months later, there'd be a relapse. Do you know what? It was so disorientating, because how can it be that I can see that you're telling the truth and then that a relapse happens?
Yeah.
Well, there is actually a scientific explanation, which is, the addiction as a brain disease model.
Yeah. And the frontal lobe shutting down.
Absolutely. And also that people suffering from addiction can live in a state of permanent dissatisfaction because their reward system, their dopamine system, isn't working properly. So the brain is never able to receive the messages that they've had enough.
Yeah.
And so they just perpetually want more and more and more. So it doesn't matter how many times you swear this is the last time, you're never going to do it again. Your brain's just going to tell you haven't had enough.
Yeah.
So it wants more.
Absolutely. And in the context of this podcast, Empathy for the Devil, it really is the addiction that's the devil. And there's a good quote from Whitney where she says, I'm always running from this giant, this big man. My mother always says, well, that's nothing but the devil. He just wants your soul, but he never gets me.
And that's a really, really good metaphor for addiction as well. And the title of our podcast, Empathy for the Devil, is like, we're empathizing with the person affected by addiction because they're often the people that get demonized.
Yes.
They're the people who get painted as bad or morally weak or lack of self-control or selfish or whatever it is. And actually what we're trying to do, or one of the things that we're trying to do, is to demonstrate that it wasn't necessarily all their fault.
Wasn't their fault at all, I don't think.
Okay, there you go.
And she tried so many times, but just couldn't get clean. And that's the saddest thing. We work with many people who struggle, but generally speaking, they get better. And we see a lot of people getting better. But it's important to remember that addiction's such a powerful illness, and many people don't get better as well.
One of the other things that we know about addiction, Tula, is that it's really important to treat underlying issues or co-occurring issues, such as mental health issues or childhood trauma. And I'm wondering if in all the times that Whitney went to rehab or tried to get help, if any of those underlying issues that you've discussed so well,
the trauma.
If any of those were addressed, because we've seen time and time again, but left unaddressed, those other things might pop up again and cause relapse.
Yeah, exactly. And I think a lot of people believe that sobriety equals recovery, but actually there's a lot more to it than that. Sobriety uncovers a lot of the low-lying trauma that then comes to the surface, and as you're saying rightly, it then needs to be treated, and that's really where the work is. And Whitney, she was starting to close herself in. She was going to rehab and not getting clean, and the marriage was crumbling. Her drug habit escalated. And she was hiding herself from the people around her who maybe would have stepped in. But she was back with Bobby, most of the time, and it was becoming a very dark, depressing place for her. I think.
And this mess, this carnage that you're describing, that was playing out on the world stage, is actually something that plays out in people's living rooms across the world, and in communities across the world. And there's nothing different about it. No. And that's the thing. Addiction is the great leveler.
Yeah, definitely. It doesn't matter if you've got loads of money or no money at all. It can cause the same devastation to the people and their souls.
What's not equal is access to treatment.
Yeah.
Obviously, it's like addiction affects everybody. Access to treatment is very, very sadly not something that everybody gets.
No. And it's harder for people to get good treatment when they don't have money. But there are people around, and there's lots of charities like Music Support who are really changing the face of that and making it available for people who can't afford private treatment.
What was it that you did some advisory work for?
I advised on a paper called The Road to Recovery, which was advising the government on how to treat people. And it was actually very focused on recognising the damage that childhood, they call it ACEs, adverse childhood experiences.
We talked about that
before.
We
talked about that. And how that resulted in addictive disorders.
And so, actually, interestingly, in the conversation about the paucity of treatment for people without the financial access to it, actually, Whitney ran out of money, and she had to leave a treatment centre that she'd been in quite long term. I think like 7 or 8 months she'd been there, and the well ran dry, and so she had to leave, which is tragic.
Yeah. It's true. She was in a rehab program in California, apparently, for 7 to 8 months and couldn't complete it, as you say. Yeah. And it was around the time when she'd filed for divorce from Bobby. So it was 2007, and it was after 14 years she was filing for divorce. So there must have been a lot of things coming into making sense for her, and she was perhaps thinking, I'm in a mess and I need to sort myself out in a more serious way than perhaps before. So another consequence to not having any money left was that she was forced to do a final tour, even though she was in no condition to really do it. And fans walked out because it was so bad, and her voice had just gone. But she was actually at risk of being homeless, because there was no money left, which is astonishing when you consider how much money there had been. So she took an acting job as something that was quite low level, nothing massive like The Bodyguard. But the important thing about that is that she found some people that she connected with, and she found a sense of community and structure that was perhaps away from the limelight, and she found it very hard to leave that.
It's funny, isn't it? Because on the one hand, having the funds could have kept her in treatment. On the other hand, not having funds, as we've talked about before, can force somebody into making a very serious assessment of their life and get them into treatment. It doesn't seem like it worked out either way, does it?
No.
For Whitney.
And that is the truth, unfortunately. I found in my work that I can't predict who's going to make it and who isn't going to make it. You just have to do your best for everybody, and try to support people to get better. But I can never tell who's going to make it. Sometimes the worst, are presenting people who you think, oh my God, this person's a mess. They're never going to make it. They're really, really damaged and chronically addicted. And then they turn around and surprise you. And then there's other people you think, oh, your problem's not so bad. You'll be able to crack it. And they just can't,
But surely it's really important to kind of to mentally give everybody the same opportunity.
Absolutely.
And it's like, actually, everybody deserves a chance of recovery, no matter what state they're in, who they are, or where they come from.
And everybody has the potential, I believe.
Exactly.
Unfortunately, in 2012, all of this led to Whitney drowning in a bath in the Beverly Hill Hotel. And she was set to perform at a pre-Grammy party.
That night?
But she didn't, apparently so.
Wow.
And only hours before.
Okay.
Clive Davis was trying to mastermind a comeback at that time, and it was possibly a turning point for her. but unfortunately it turned the wrong way.
Had she got into recovery just before? Was it kind of, if there was a comeback being planned, was there some kind of life change going on?
I think she was stable.
Right.
I don't know if she was in recovery as we might define it, or
Sure.
as we know it to be. Toxicology reports found that there was cocaine and prescription medications, particularly Xanax, in her system, and but her death was ruled as an accidental drowning because she
Do you
was
think
in the
maybe
bath.
she just passed out in the bath?
Yeah, I
and
think
drowned?
that's very likely. Yeah.
It's really shocking, isn't it? And we've seen it before in this series, and we'll see it again, is the role that prescription drugs play in the untimely death of a lot of people that we've been talking about. And it's actually something that's growing and growing and growing. And now I think some of the figures that I've been looking at are really shocking about how drugs that are meant to be used on a prescription basis, dished out by doctors, are actually becoming misused and contributing to people's deaths.
Yeah. And the most tragic thing, I feel, is that only 6 months after Whitney dying in the bath, her daughter actually died in pretty much exactly the same way,
Bobby Christina.
in her bath at home. Yeah, found unconscious.
I was thinking about that, actually. Perhaps it's not so uncommon. I guess if you're going to be sitting in a bath full of water and you are taking substances that are going to knock you out,
Yeah.
it's not a big stretch to imagine that you're going to slide down the bath and your face is going to go under the water, right? It's probably not unusual.
No.
There's also, I won't go into them now, but there's a lot of examples of children of people who've passed through addiction passing in exactly the same way.
Really?
Yeah.
Wow.
Yep.
There might be something in that, mightn't there?
I think there's something in the heartbreak as well. Often people who lose somebody that they love then pass away for one reason or another, soon after. And I think all the spirit perhaps wants to join them. Very sad.
Yeah, it's sad. So, Chula, you said at the beginning of this episode that that you personally related to Whitney's story. You've told it to us so beautifully. And I guess I want to know what you're thinking or feeling, having, us gone through this conversation, and what do you think?
Well, it's just so tragically sad that she didn't find recovery, because there were several points in her story where she possibly could have done. And really, we're left with the end of the story and the breakdown of the marriage, and then the tragic end for her daughter, and all of the stuff that we've talked about. But really, it started right at the beginning with childhood sexual abuse, and one could argue if that hadn't happened, maybe things would be very different, and she might even still be here. So it's really important, I think, to remember that it's the childhood trauma that causes the problem to begin with. And there's a writer and theorist called Alice Miller, and she talks about how often the people that become addicts, in their trauma when they were at home, they didn't have what she calls an enlightened witness. And then, when people do have somebody, and I remember reading about Dizzy Rascal and how he had this teacher at school who kind of stepped into the paternal role and really, really fathered him and nurtured him, and he felt that person saved him. And it's really important, I think, that when children are isolated, that we come in and give them the support that they need, because that can make all the difference.
So what you're saying is that early intervention, when there's known trauma for children, is imperative, actually, if there is any hope of this not rolling out with the familiar story of addiction and the devastating effects on that for the person and everybody that loves them.
Yeah. And it's about support. It's not necessarily about diagnosing someone with something or pathologizing, or definitely not sort of creating more of a problem than there needs to be. It's about support, connection, love, care, recognizing when children aren't getting that and being able to fill that gap.
And also, I think this is really, really tragic and really quite depressing. It feels to me like it's the end of a Shakespearean tragedy with bodies all over the stage and blood everywhere.
Yeah.
I think it's really important to point out that this doesn't just happen in the kind of the dizzy heights of Hollywood in the Beverly Hills Hotel.
No.
You know, it happens at kitchen sinks around the country and around the world, and that help is available.
Yes.
And and not every story needs to end like Whitney's story. I think that's the point. And you just mentioned early intervention, and equally, it's like intervention at any stage.
Yeah.
This was not an unchangeable story, because at any stage in anybody's life, if they get the correct help, which often starts with honesty, obviously it needs to start with honesty, but if somebody's honest enough to express that they're in trouble and to express what their needs are, and they get the correct help, then that story can be changed.
Yeah. And we need to listen when they do that.
Absolutely.
So, one of the brilliant things that I've done over the years is gone along to some of the NA and AA conventions. And I have often thought, I don't think I've ever seen or heard somebody so fucking impressive as that individual on the stage that's just shared their story. And often when, I speak to people that are worried about somebody, and the opportunity there for them to shine in the most bright and brilliant and fabulous way is there, and the most impressive people for me are those people that have gone through that and come out the other side,
Absolutely.
And it's all to fucking play for. It's all to play for. And on that note, I will take the candle out, and I want to just remember Whitney. In fact, where are we gonna leave Whitney?
Well, I was thinking of leaving Whitney in 1991 when she took the stage before the 25th Super Bowl and she sang her version of the Star-Spangled Banner, backed by a full orchestra. And, it was a really important moment in history, for this strong black woman who had accomplished so much to be up there singing that in front of all those people, and maybe there was still all of these things going on in the background, but ultimately, what an amazing achievement for her.
Maybe we'll leave it in the show notes, a link to that particular performance, but I have read that it's one of her best.
Yes.
So Whitney, you fucking legend. We're thinking about you, singing on behalf of your country and to the world, and with a gazillion eyes on you, and you absolutely fucking slaying it. So God bless.
Here's to you, Whitney. Chula, well, let's round things off nicely with your one for the road.
My one for the road is a book called The Road Less Travelled.
Oh, yes.
By M. Scott Peck.
Absolutely.
Yeah, so it's something that I was encouraged to read when I, first got into recovery. And it's an amazing book in that it just kind of teaches, it taught me just about letting go of all the preconceptions I'd had about myself and my life, and even the trauma that I'd been through, about addiction, what it was and what it had taken from me, and embrace the future, embrace the road ahead, and to do that with courage and hope and excitement and inspiration, and love, really. And,
great choice.
Yeah, and I've recommended it to so many of my clients, and they all come back and go, "Oh my God, that's such an amazing book!" So, read it.
Well done, Chula. I absolutely loved hearing Whitney's story from you, and thanks, Matt, as well, for what you said. And it's just so lovely to be able to honour such an incredible female black woman in the way that we have, and I hope we've done her proud.
A privilege.
Thanks so much for listening.
In the next episode, we'll be taking a long look at the short but incredible life of Little Peep, the emo rap pioneer.
We'll see you then.